Wild West love stories. Tales of passion, written on the American frontier.
The paper in his hand felt as flimsy as a dead leaf, yet Silas Blackwood brandished it as if it were a royal decree, each crisp letter a testament to his ownership. He stood on the muddy main street of Redemption Gulch, his fine woolen coat an island of dark, expensive fabric in a sea of homespun desperation. The mail-order bride contract, held aloft in a gloved hand, fluttered in the biting wind. "She's mine, Thorne," he announced, his voice a low, confident purr that carried with unnerving clarity in the tense silence. Signed, sealed, and paid for. The law, as Sheriff Brody here can attest, is quite clear on matters of property. His eyes, cold and dark as a frozen well, were not on the paper, but on the woman who stood half-shielded behind Caleb Thorne's formidable frame. Eleonora Vance trembled, the frigid air a secondary concern to the chilling certainty in that man's gaze. He was a predator who had finally cornered his prey. Caleb did not look at the paper. He didn't need to. He felt the weight of Blackwood's words, the suffocating presence of his power that held the entire town in its thrall. He shifted his weight, a subtle adjustment that nonetheless spoke volumes, placing himself more squarely between them. He became a wall, not of anger, but of unyielding resolve. His worn duster, stained with the honest dirt of his land, seemed more a suit of armor than Blackwood's pristine coat. The air grew thick, charged with the unspoken history of a town too long cowed into submission. This was more than a dispute over a contract. It was a clash of worlds. It was the calculated greed of a tyrant against the raw, protective instinct of a man who had nothing left to lose but his soul. What happens when a haunted soldier, a man who has spent years building a fortress of solitude to escape his own demons, decides that a stranger's freedom is a cause worth dying for? And what hell will be unleashed when the most powerful man in the territory, a man who has never been denied anything, comes to collect? Stay with us, for this is a story of a love forged in the heart of a blizzard and tested by the fires of absolute greed. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe to Wild West Love Stories for more tales where courage is the only currency that truly matters. Part 1. Whispers in the Blizzard. The Montana winter did not arrive gently. It descended like a conquering army, sharp and merciless. For Caleb Thorne, it was a familiar adversary. He felt its approach in the deep, resonant ache of his bones, a living almanac of past pains. He woke long before the sun, when the cabin was still steeped in a profound, frigid darkness. The first breath of the day was a shock, a mouthful of ice that reminded him he was alive. His morning routine was a ritual, a silent liturgy performed with the methodical grace of a man who finds comfort in order. He moved through the pre-dawn gloom, his calloused hands finding each object by memory. The kindling box, the iron stove latch, the worn handle of the coffee pot. Stoking the embers of last night's fire back to life was the first victory of the day. The soft hiss and crackle as the flames caught was the cabin's waking breath, a sound that pushed back against the oppressive silence that had been his only companion for 3 long years. This land was his inheritance, a legacy of sweat and grit bequeathed by a father who had seen promise in its harsh beauty. The cabin, the barn, every fence post hammered into the unyielding soil, they were all that was left of him. Caleb was its custodian, its lone guardian. He felt the weight of it every day, a responsibility that was both an anchor and a chain. As he drank his coffee, black and bitter, he stared out the small window at the vast, empty expanse of his property. The land was a demanding master, but an honest one. It didn't lie or deceive. It gave back exactly what you put into it, a brutal fairness he had not found in the world of men. That was the world he had left behind, the world that still visited him in his dreams. The ghosts of Gettysburg were relentless. They came to him not as apparitions, but as sensory assaults. The acrid smell of gunpowder that clung to the air like a shroud, the high-pitched whine of a Minié-ball, the deafening roar of a cannonade that shook the very earth. He would remember the face of a young private from Ohio, his eyes wide with a question Caleb could never answer. He remembered the impossible calm that would settle over him as he raised his rifle, the world narrowing to the man in his sights, the chilling detachment required to be a dealer of death. Those memories were the reason for this self-imposed exile. Solitude was his penance, and the silence of the plains was his sanctuary. By mid-morning, the sky had changed. The brilliant, cold blue had been swallowed by a bruised, steel-gray canvas that stretched from one horizon to the other. The wind began to pick up, its voice changing from a whisper to a low, mournful moan. Caleb knew the signs. A true blizzard was coming, the kind that could bury a man alive and erase the world. A grim sense of satisfaction settled over him. He was prepared. He spent the afternoon in a flurry of purposeful activity, a general preparing his fortress for a siege. He checked the seals on the windows, secured the barn door with a heavy new bolt, and led his horse and a single milk cow into the relative warmth of their stalls, giving them extra feed. He split a small mountain of firewood, the rhythmic thud of the axe a defiant drumbeat against the rising wind. Each log stacked neatly on the porch was another small act of control, another bulwark against the chaos of the coming storm. As the first flakes of snow began to fall, thick and heavy as wet ash, Caleb retreated into his cabin and barred the door. The world outside could rage. In here, he was the master. He was safe from the storm, and for a little while, he might even be safe from himself. Miles away, Eleonora, Nora. Vance was learning the true meaning of chaos. Her escape from Silas Blackwood's gilded prison had been an act of pure, desperate instinct. In the dead of night, she had knotted bedsheets together, her heart hammering against her ribs with a terror so profound it was almost silent. The drop from the second-story window had been jarring, stealing the breath from her lungs. She had landed in a snow-covered garden, the frozen roses tearing at her dress like skeletal claws. The horse, a fine mare she had liberated from Blackwood's stable, had been her one hope. For the first few hours, as they galloped through the moonlit pines, she had allowed herself a flicker of that hope. She was free. She was a nurse, a capable woman who had survived the horrors of a field hospital. She could surely survive this. Then the blizzard had descended. It did not just snow, it attacked. The wind was a physical force, a malevolent entity that tore at her clothes and sought to rip her from the saddle. The snow was not a gentle blanket, but a blinding, suffocating curtain of white that erased the trail, the trees, the very concept of direction. The horse, a creature of refined breeding, was no match for the storm's primal fury. It stumbled, its breath coming in great, panicked clouds of steam. Nora had dismounted, trying to lead the terrified animal, her own face raw and numb from the wind's assault. The mare went down one final time, a soft, defeated sigh escaping its lips, its dark eyes pleading. Leaving the horse was one of the hardest things Nora had ever done, a surrender that felt like a betrayal. Now, she was alone. The hope she'd harbored was frozen and dead. All that remained was the will to take one more step, and then one more. She thought of her father, a quiet man who had taught her that resilience was a form of grace. She thought of the soldiers she had tended, men with horrific wounds who had fought for one more breath. She would not dishonor their memory by giving up, but her body was betraying her will. The cold was a creeping poison, turning her limbs to lead, her thoughts to slush. She was dying. She knew it with a calm, clinical certainty. She stumbled and fell, the snow embracing her like a soft bed. It would be so easy to close her eyes, to sleep. It was then, through the white curtain of her own mortality, that she saw it. A light. A tiny, impossible spark of gold, flickering in the heart of the maelstrom. It couldn't be real. It was a dying dream, a final trick of a frozen mind. But some primal part of her, the part that refused to be extinguished, reached for it. She crawled. Her knees and hands were raw, but she didn't feel them. The light was her entire universe. The cabin, when she finally reached it, was more a shape, a suggestion of structure in the swirling snow, than a solid object. She clawed her way onto the porch, her last ounce of strength spent. She couldn't call out. Her throat was a frozen knot. She slumped against the heavy wooden door, a final, desperate act of arrival, and then the world went black. The sound was what roused Caleb from his reverie by the fire. A soft, scraping thud against the door, almost indistinguishable from the groans of the cabin as the wind tried to tear it apart. But it was different. It had weight. It was the sound of a body. His soldier's instincts screamed. It was a trap, a ruse. No sane person was out in this. He grabbed his rifle, moving with a predator's silence to the door. He peered through a tiny gap in the shutter, his eye pressed against the cold wood. He saw a shape, a heap of snow-covered rags. He remembered finding a picket guard once, asleep at his post, frozen solid in a similar slump. A flicker of memory, unwanted and sharp. The boy couldn't have been more than 17. The soldier in him commanded him to stay put, to guard his fortress. But the man, the one who had seen too much death, could not. With a low curse, he unbarred the door. The wind ripped it from his grasp, howling into the room, bringing with it a vortex of snow and a blast of Arctic air that extinguished one of the lamps. And there, at his feet, was a woman, her face as white as the snow in her hair. As he stared down, her eyelids fluttered open for a bare second. Her eyes, the color of a stormy sky, met his. In them, he saw no threat, only the last embers of a life about to go out. The battle in his mind was over. He leaned his rifle against the wall, bent down into the raging storm, and gathered the impossible weight of the stranger into his arms. He fought the wind to close and bar the door, shutting the blizzard out. But as he laid the woman gently on the rug before the hearth, he knew he had just let a far more complicated storm in. Part 2. The shelter of a stranger. Nora woke in pieces. First came the awareness of warmth, a deep, penetrating heat that seemed to be coaxing her frozen limbs back to life. Then came the pain, a dull, throbbing ache in every muscle, the protest of a body pushed far beyond its limits. She smelled wood smoke, the rich, earthy scent of brewing coffee, and something else, the faint, clean smell of gun oil. Her eyes fluttered open. She was lying on a simple cot, tucked under a mountain of heavy wool blankets that felt as weighty as earth itself. A massive stone hearth dominated the wall opposite her, a fire roaring within its depths. The cabin was small, built for one, and it was undeniably a man's domain. Everything was functional, stripped of ornament, yet possessed a kind of rugged order. Axes and tools hung from pegs on the wall, meticulously cleaned. A small shelf of books, Shakespeare, the Bible, a well-worn copy of Marcus Aurelius, was tucked into a corner. It was the space of a man who was self-sufficient, and perhaps profoundly lonely. Her host sat at a small, hand-carved table in the center of the room. Caleb Thorne did not look at her, though she knew he was aware of her every movement. He was disassembling his rifle, cleaning each component with a focused, almost meditative precision. The movements of his hands were economical and sure. They were strong hands, scarred and calloused from hard labor, but they moved with a surgeon's delicacy over the intricate metal parts of the weapon. He was a paradox, a man of the earth who was intimately familiar with machines of death. Nora sat up, the blankets pooling around her. Her dress, she saw, was hanging from a line strung near the fire, steaming gently. It had been carefully cleaned of the worst of the mud and ice. On a stool beside her cot, a man's flannel shirt, worn soft with countless washings, had been left for her. The gesture was both practical and surprisingly thoughtful. It was an offering of dignity, and she was intensely grateful for it. She slipped the large shirt on. It smelled faintly of pine and cold air. "There's coffee," he said, finally breaking the silence. His voice was a low baritone, rough around the edges like unplaned wood. He didn't turn around, his attention still fixed on his task. "And water in the bucket if you're thirsty." Nora rose, her legs unsteady, and made her way to the stove. The hot tin cup he had left for her warmed her numb fingers. She stood there for a long moment, sipping the scalding coffee, trying to formulate the words she needed. How did one thank a man for saving her life? How did one explain the terror that had driven her to his door without inviting a danger that could consume him, too? She decided on simplicity. "Thank you," she said, her own voice sounding thin and strange in the quiet room. He merely grunted in acknowledgement, sliding a freshly oiled bolt back into the rifle's chamber with a soft, decisive click. They lapsed back into silence, a silence that was not empty, but filled with the unspoken questions that hung between them. She was a mystery that had washed up on his shore. He was the stoic lighthouse keeper whose motives she could not yet fathom. The storm raged outside, a constant, howling reminder of their shared confinement. For the first time in a long time, Caleb was not alone in his fortress. He could feel her presence as a change in the very air of the cabin, a disruption to the gravitational pull of his solitude. He found the feeling to be deeply unsettling, and yet he could not bring himself to regret it. He had seen the brink of death in her eyes, and in pulling her back from it, he felt a flicker of something he had long thought buried, a purpose beyond mere survival. As the day wore on, they settled into a strange, unspoken rhythm. Confined by the relentless blizzard, they moved around each other in the small space with a wary courtesy. Caleb performed his indoor chores with a restless energy, reinforcing a loose shutter that rattled in the wind, mending a piece of leather tack, his hands always needing to be busy. Nora, desperate to contribute, to prove she was not a helpless burden, found his small sewing kit. She took down her own torn dress and began to meticulously repair it, her small, neat stitches a testament to a life that had known refinement before it had known desperation. The shared, quiet industry was a language of its own, a way of communicating mutual respect without the complication of words. Late in the afternoon, Caleb was reaching for a heavy log from the top of the woodpile stacked inside by the door. He moved with his usual strength, but as he twisted, a sharp, audible gasp of pain escaped him. His face went rigid, and he instinctively clutched his right shoulder, his knuckles turning white. He tried to straighten up, to pretend it was nothing, but a deep, radiating agony was etched in the tight lines around his eyes. It was the old wound, the shrapnel from a Yankee cannon shell that the army surgeon had declared too risky to remove. It was a constant companion, a piece of the war he carried embedded in his own flesh, and the bitter cold had inflamed it to a nearly unbearable degree. Nora was on her feet in an instant. The hesitant stranger vanished, replaced by the calm, authoritative presence of a nurse. "Sit down," she commanded, her voice leaving no room for argument. Caleb, stubborn and proud, started to protest. "It's nothing. Sit. Down. Now," she repeated, her gaze firm. Gritting his teeth against the pain, he relented, sinking onto a stool by the hearth. He flinched as she gently pushed his shirt aside to examine the injury. The scar was a vicious, puckered map of old trauma, the skin around it red and swollen. Her touch, however, was surprisingly gentle. "I am a nurse," she said softly, as if sensing his unspoken question. "I tended men with wounds far worse than this in Virginia." This revelation hung in the air, changing everything. She was not some fragile runaway. She was a veteran, a fellow survivor of the crucible that had defined their generation. She retrieved her small satchel, and from it, a small tin of a pungent, herbal salve. As she began to massage the balm into the knotted, inflamed muscles of his shoulder, her professional touch was both a relief and an intimacy he hadn't experienced in years. The warmth of her hands, combined with the soothing heat of the salve, began to unlock the vice of pain. "You have a steady hand," he grunted, the closest he could come to a compliment. "I learned to," she replied, her eyes focused on her work. A trembling hand in a field hospital could cost a man his leg. They fell silent, but it was a new kind of silence, one layered with shared understanding. They had both witnessed the absolute worst of humanity and had somehow endured. When she was finished, she bound the shoulder with a strip of clean linen. The relief was immense, washing over him in a wave. "Thank you," he said, and this time, the words carried a weight of genuine gratitude that went far beyond the act itself. He had let his guard down, had allowed another person to see his weakness, and she had met it not with pity, but with competence and compassion. As evening fell, the atmosphere in the cabin had irrevocably shifted. The barriers of suspicion had been replaced by a fragile bridge of trust. He found himself watching her, the way the firelight caught the red highlights in her hair, the quiet grace in her movements. She was no longer an intrusion. She was just Nora. And as the wind howled its lonely song outside, Caleb Thorne felt the first, tentative thaw in the long, frozen winter of his own heart. Part 3. The Shelter of a Stranger. The world was born anew in silence and blinding light. After 3 days of unrelenting fury, the blizzard had exhausted itself, leaving behind a landscape of impossible, virginal beauty. The sun, a welcome stranger, climbed a sky of brilliant, crystalline blue, scattering diamonds across the vast, sculpted drifts of snow. The silence was absolute, a sacred hush that felt as if the world was holding its breath. The preparations for the journey to Redemption Gulch were conducted in this same hushed quiet, a mood dictated by the solemnity of the morning and the unspoken tension of their impending separation. Caleb hitched his strongest horse, a sturdy buckskin named Anchor, to the sleigh, his movements efficient and practiced. He packed a small crate with blankets, a thermos of hot coffee, and a parcel of dried beef and hardtack, provisions for a journey through a world that was beautiful but still treacherous. Nora emerged from the cabin dressed in her own clothes. She had mended the tears with thread as dark as her dress, the stitches nearly invisible. The borrowed flannel shirt lay neatly folded on the cot. Putting her own dress back on felt like donning a uniform, slipping back into a role she no longer recognized. The past few days in the cabin, she had been simply Nora, a survivor. Now, she was once again Eleonora Vance, the fugitive. She looked at Caleb, at his strong, capable hands securing the last of the harnesses, and felt a profound and painful reluctance to leave. This small cabin, this fortress of solitude, had become the only safe harbor she had known in weeks. Its owner, a man of few words and deep wounds, had shown her a quiet kindness that felt more real than all the polished pleasantries of the world she had fled. The journey began. The runners of the sleigh whispered over the pristine snow, the only sound besides the rhythmic puffing of Anchor's breath and the soft jingle of the harness. They spoke little. The sheer, overwhelming majesty of the landscape seemed to demand silence. Caleb pointed out landmarks, his voice a low rumble against the vast quiet. "That's Widow's Peak over there. They say a prospector's wife watched from that ridge for a husband who never came back." He spoke of the land as if it were a living thing, full of stories and ghosts. Nora listened, her anxiety a cold knot in her stomach. With every mile, the knot tightened. She scanned the horizon not with awe, but with the hyper-vigilance of the hunted. Was that a curl of smoke from a chimney, or just the wind kicking up snow? Was that a rider on a distant ridge, or just a trick of the light? Redemption Gulch. The name itself was a bitter irony. She had come seeking redemption from a life of poverty and loneliness, only to find a different kind of damnation waiting for her. As they crested the final hill and the town came into view below, a cluster of dark, wooden buildings huddled in the snow-filled valley, her heart began to hammer against her ribs. From this distance, it looked peaceful, almost picturesque. But Nora knew better. She knew that beneath that quaint facade lay a heart of pure menace, and that at its center sat Silas Blackwood, a spider waiting patiently in the middle of his web. Caleb sensed her fear. He saw the way she stiffened, the way her hand gripped the side rail of the sleigh until her knuckles were white. "It's just a town," he said quietly, though his own eyes were narrowed, scanning the streets below with a soldier's practiced caution. "We'll see the pastor, and you'll be on your way." But as they descended into that valley, both of them knew, with a grim certainty, that it would not be that simple. The main street of Redemption Gulch was unnervingly quiet. As their sleigh glided past the general store and the blacksmith shop, Nora felt dozens of eyes on her from behind curtained windows. Doors that had been open were quietly closed. The town was holding its breath, watching. The atmosphere was thick with a collective, unspoken fear. They pulled up before the small, white-steepled church, its paint peeling from the harsh winters. It was meant to be a house of sanctuary, but today it felt like just another building in Silas Blackwood's kingdom. Before Caleb could even tie off the reins, the double doors of the Blackwood saloon swung open across the street. Silas Blackwood emerged, followed by the hulking shadow of Sheriff Brody. Blackwood was not a man who hurried. He stepped onto the boardwalk with a deliberate, proprietary air, brushing an imaginary speck of dust from the sleeve of his immaculate coat. He took in the scene, the sleigh, the wary horse, Caleb, and finally, Nora, and a slow, reptilian smile spread across his handsome face. It was the smile of a chess master who has just seen his opponent walk into a perfectly laid trap. "Well, well," he called out, his voice echoing in the stillness. "It seems the little bird has tired of the cold and decided to fly home. I must thank you, Mr. Thorne, for retrieving my property." The word, property, was a physical blow. It stripped Nora of her humanity, reducing her to a chattel, a thing to be owned and retrieved. Caleb stepped down from the sleigh, his boots landing with a solid thud in the snow. He moved to stand beside Nora, his presence a silent declaration. "She is not your property," Caleb stated, his voice devoid of heat, but as hard and unyielding as granite. "She is a free woman." Blackwood chuckled, a condescending sound that grated on the nerves. He and Brody crossed the street, their confident strides a stark contrast to the fearful stillness of the town. Blackwood stopped a few feet away, pulling the folded contract from his inner pocket. "This legal document says otherwise," he purred, waving it gently. "A simple agreement. A wife in exchange for passage and a new life. She signed it of her own free will. Now, Sheriff," he said, turning to Brody, "this man is interfering with a lawful contract. I believe that's a crime." Sheriff Brody, a man whose spine seemed to have been replaced by jelly, put a hand on the butt of his pistol. "He's right, Thorne. This is a legal matter. You need to step away and let Mr. Blackwood handle his business." But Caleb did not move. He had seen this kind of power before, on the battlefield, the power of officers who sent good men to die for their own glory. He had followed orders then. He would not follow them now. His gaze shifted from Blackwood's smug face to Nora's, and what he saw there, a terrifying mix of defiance and despair, solidified his resolve. The years of self-imposed exile, of running from the man he had been, were over. Blackwood, impatient, took a step forward, his hand reaching out to grab Nora's arm. In a flash, Caleb's hand shot out, not in a punch, but in a precise, controlled movement. He caught Blackwood's wrist, his fingers clamping down with the crushing strength of a blacksmith's vice. The bones in Blackwood's wrist ground together. A flicker of shock, then pain, flashed across the tyrant's face. The entire street seemed to gasp as one. No one touched Silas Blackwood. "You will not," Caleb said, his voice a low, deadly whisper that was more menacing than any shout. "Lay a hand on her." For a breathless moment, they were locked in that tableau. Blackwood, his face pale with fury and surprise, tried to wrench his arm free but couldn't. He saw something in Caleb's eyes then, a quiet, lethal stillness he had only ever seen in the most dangerous of men. He had made a grave miscalculation. With a final, agonizing squeeze, Caleb released him. Blackwood stumbled back, cradling his wrist, his mask of civility shattered. "You will regret this, Thorne," he hissed, his voice trembling with rage. "Every man in this valley knows your deed is in my bank's vault. I own you. I will ruin you, and I will have what is mine." He turned on his heel and stormed back towards his saloon, a king who had been challenged in his own court. The immediate danger had passed, but as Caleb helped a trembling Nora back onto the sleigh, they both knew the truth. This was not the end. It was the declaration of a war they could not hope to win, but one they now had to fight together. Part 4. A Promise Forged in Fire. The silence on the sleigh ride back to the ranch was heavier than any blizzard. It was not the tentative quiet of two strangers anymore, but the taut, assessing silence of soldiers after a first skirmish, both acutely aware that the full battle was yet to come. Once back inside the cabin, the familiar space felt altered. It was no longer just a shelter. It had become a fortress, a command post for a war they had not chosen, but now had to wage. Caleb stoked the fire, the flames throwing long, agitated shadows across the stone walls as he moved. Finally, he turned to face Nora, his expression a mask of grim determination, his eyes demanding the whole truth she had been carrying. He needed to know the full measure of his enemy. "He said you were to be his wife," Caleb began, his voice low and steady. "That was a lie. You're running from him. I need to know why." "All of it." Nora took a deep, shuddering breath, the terror of the past days threatening to unravel her. But looking at Caleb, at the resolute set of his jaw and the unwavering strength in his gaze, she found her courage. He had gambled his life for her. He deserved the truth. The mail-order bride story, it was a deception, she confessed, her voice a mere whisper at first, then gaining strength with each word. "I was hired through an agency back east, not as a wife, but as a private nurse. The advertisement claimed it was for an elderly, ailing father. When I arrived, there was no father. There was only him." She began to describe the opulent, suffocating house where Blackwood had installed her, a prisoner in all but name. He had been charming at first, a perfect gentleman, but she soon saw the chilling cruelty beneath the polished veneer. He wasn't seeking a caregiver. He was seeking a beautiful ornament, another prize to display as proof of his power. "He is consuming this entire valley," she explained, the words tumbling out faster now, fueled by a righteous anger. "He finds families who are struggling, uses his bank to leverage them into impossible debt, and then he finds ways to foreclose. I saw the books. Caleb. I heard him planning with Sheriff Brody. They were forging documents, altering ledgers, creating debts out of thin air. They are thieves, dressed in fine suits and hiding behind the shield of the law." The final piece of the puzzle fell into place with chilling clarity. "One night, I couldn't sleep. I went to his study for a book, and I found a hidden ledger. It detailed everything, the names of the families, the real amounts they owed versus the fabricated ones, the illegal methods he used to ruin them. He found me with it in my hands." Her voice trembled as she recalled the moment, the terrifying shift in his eyes from charming suitor to cold-blooded predator. "He didn't get angry. He smiled. He told me that now that I knew his business so intimately, I would have to become part of his family, permanently. That I would be his wife, and that my silence would be my dowry. He locked me in my room. I knew I couldn't let him win. I could not be owned by a man like that. So I fled, that very night, into the storm." Caleb listened, his silence more profound than any outburst. Each word Nora spoke was a piece of a map, and the territory it revealed was one of systematic evil. He thought of his own father, an honest, unyielding man who had always been suspicious of the progress Blackwood promised. He thought of this very land, bought with sweat and sacrifice, not with ink and deception. Blackwood's threat against his deed was no longer just a threat. It was a calculated move in a game that had been rigged from the start. The fight for Nora had irrevocably become the fight for his home, for his father's legacy, and for every decent, struggling soul in Redemption Gulch. The ghosts of the war that haunted his quiet moments receded, replaced by a new, burning clarity. He had fought for a union, for an ideal. Now, he would fight for a woman and a piece of earth. And this was a war he would not lose. "We cannot hide here," Nora said, her voice filled with a newfound steel. For the first time since she'd arrived, the fear in her eyes had been supplanted by a burning flame of defiance. "He will use the law, your deed, everything he has to crush you and get to me. Our only chance is to expose him." Caleb gave a slow, deliberate nod, a plan beginning to form in the strategic corners of his soldier's mind. "The folks in that town are scared of him," he said. "Words won't be enough. They need to see that he can be defied." Their decision made, they rode back into Redemption Gulch the next day, not as fugitives, but as insurgents. The town was just as tense as before, but this time, they moved with a clear purpose. Their destination was the general store, the place where news and whispers were traded like currency. As they neared, a commotion spilled out from the shadows of the saloon alley. A small, ragged girl, no older than 10, had dropped a crate of whiskey bottles. One of Blackwood's hulking henchmen stood over her, his face a mask of rage, his hand raised to strike. It was Lily. Without a flicker of hesitation, Nora pushed through the small circle of silent, passive onlookers. "Stop!" she commanded, her voice ringing with an authority that made the brute pause mid-swing. She knelt beside the weeping child, ignoring the glittering shards of glass. "Are you hurt?" she asked gently, her trained nurse's eyes scanning Lily's hands for cuts. The henchman sneered. "This is saloon business. Mind your own, lady." Caleb stepped up beside Nora, his presence a silent, lethal warning. He said nothing. He simply looked at the man, and the henchman, remembering the unyielding strength in Caleb's grip from the day before, slowly lowered his hand. Nora helped Lily to her feet, her expression a potent mixture of fury and compassion. "This child is filthy and underfed," she declared, her voice carrying to the watching crowd. "She's feverish. In a town with a church and a doctor, this is a disgrace." Her words were a direct challenge, not just to the thug, but to the collective conscience of the townspeople who had stood by and watched. She led Lily away, toward the doctor's office, with Caleb as her unwavering shadow. This small, public act of defiance was like a stone thrown into a stagnant pond, sending ripples of consequence throughout the town. People who had long cowered in fear now looked on with a glimmer of admiration. The town doctor, a weary man worn down by years of Blackwood's intimidation, was moved by Nora's courage and tended to Lily without charge, diagnosing a severe case of malnutrition and exhaustion. The blacksmith's wife appeared with a warm blanket and a bowl of broth. Small acts of rebellion, all sparked by one woman's refusal to look away. Later that evening, as they prepared to leave town, the blacksmith, a man with powerful arms and a quiet demeanor, approached them. "What you did today, it took real sand," he said, pressing a small, heavy pouch into Caleb's hand. "It ain't much, but it's what a few of us could spare. For your fight." It was then that Caleb and Nora knew they were no longer alone. On the ride back to the ranch, with Lily wrapped in the new blanket and asleep between them, a profound change had occurred. The unspoken attraction had deepened into a powerful bond of respect and shared purpose. They were no longer just a man and a woman caught in a storm. They were partners. Under the vast, star-dusted canopy of the Montana sky, they made a silent promise to each other, a promise to stand together, to fight, and to build something new from the ashes of Blackwood's tyranny. Part 5. The Reckoning at Redemption Gulch. News of their defiance and the town's nascent rebellion reached Silas Blackwood almost immediately. He was a man who thrived on the illusion of absolute control, and he could feel it slipping through his fingers like fine sand. His retaliation was swift, cold, and legal. The very next morning, Sheriff Brody rode out to the Thorne ranch. He didn't come with threats or bluster this time. He came with a hammer and a single nail, which he used to affix an official notice of foreclosure squarely onto Caleb's front door. The ink was stark and black against the weathered wood, a legal declaration of war. The terms were brutally simple. The long-standing family debt, which Blackwood had allowed to lie dormant for years as a tool of leverage, was now due in full. The deadline was 48 hours. The sum was impossible. The notice was a death sentence for the ranch, for everything Caleb's father had bled and sweat to build. Later that day, Blackwood himself paid a visit. He came alone, exuding an air of magnanimous victory. He found Caleb by the corral, splitting firewood with a ferocious, rhythmic energy, each swing of the axe a blow against his own rising despair. Lily was on the porch, wrapped in one of Nora's shawls, watching him with the wide, trusting eyes of a child who has finally found safety. Nora stood in the doorway, her posture a silent challenge. "I'm a reasonable man, Thorne," Blackwood began, his voice as smooth as polished riverstone. "I take no pleasure in seeing a family legacy like this one dismantled. This is all just unpleasant business." He gestured lazily toward the foreclosure notice. "But there is a simple solution. An offer." He let the word hang in the crisp air. "Give me the woman. Simply sign a bill of sale, acknowledging the terms of her original contract. In return, I will personally tear up this notice. Your deed will be returned to you, free and clear. The debt erased. You can keep your father's ranch. You can go back to your quiet life. All I ask for is what is rightfully mine." The offer was insidious, a poisoned apple presented as a cure. For a fleeting, terrible moment, Caleb felt its pull. The ranch. His father's ghost was in the grain of the barn wood, his mother's in the wild roses that grew by the creek. To lose it would be to fail them completely. He looked at the weathered structures, the sturdy fences, the endless sky above the land that was his birthright. Then, his gaze fell on Nora, standing tall and unbroken in the doorway, and on Lily, a small child who had known nothing but cruelty until 2 days ago. He saw the trust in their eyes, a trust he had earned not with land or money, but with integrity. He knew, in that gut-wrenching instant, that a home was more than just soil and timber. A legacy was more than just a name on a deed. He turned back to Blackwood, his eyes clear and hard as winter ice. "Get off my land," he said, the words packed with the full, unshakable force of his conviction. Blackwood's mask of civility finally dropped, revealing the ugly sneer beneath. "You fool!" he spat, his voice venomous. "You'll lose everything for a runaway whore who isn't worth the ink on her contract." He stormed away, leaving the foreclosure notice on the door as a ticking clock, counting down to their ruin. That night, under the soft, steady glow of a kerosene lamp, Caleb, Nora, and their few new allies, the blacksmith and the doctor, laid out their final, desperate plan. They would not wait for Blackwood's deadline to destroy them. They would bring the fight to him. They would call a town meeting the next day, on the steps of the very bank Blackwood used as his throne, and they would burn his kingdom to the ground with the one weapon he could never buy: the truth. The next afternoon, the main street of Redemption Gulch was a theater of tension. Word had spread like a fever. On one side, on the raised boardwalk in front of his bank, stood Silas Blackwood, flanked by Sheriff Brody and a handful of hard-faced men whose loyalty was bought and paid for. He looked perfectly composed, a king ready to preside over the execution of a few rebellious peasants. On the other side, in the muddy street below, stood Caleb and Nora. Behind them, a crowd of townspeople had gathered, their faces a volatile mixture of fear, anger, and a desperate, flickering hope. Lily stood close to Nora, her small hand clutching a fold of her dress, her presence a silent, powerful testimony. Caleb stepped forward, his voice clear and strong, carrying across the silent street. He didn't plead or argue. He spoke as a soldier addressing his countrymen. "For too long, we have allowed fear to be the law in this town," he began, his eyes meeting those of his neighbors one by one. "We've kept our heads down, worked our land, and hoped the wolf would pass our door. But a wolf that is fed only grows hungrier. Today, that ends." Blackwood let out a short, derisive laugh. Brave words from a man who won't have a roof over his head come morning. It was Nora's turn. She stepped forward, her voice trembling slightly at first, but gaining strength and clarity as she held up the small, worn leather ledger. "This isn't about one man's home," she said, her voice ringing with conviction. "It's about all of ours." She began to read. She called out the names of families, one by one. The Millers, who had lost their fertile south pasture to a clerical error. The Garcias, whose water rights had been stolen through a forged signature on a loan document they couldn't read. With each name, a gasp or a murmur of recognition went through the crowd. She wasn't speaking in hypotheticals. She was telling their own secret, shameful stories back to them, revealing the cold, methodical treachery that had impoverished them all. Panic began to flicker in Blackwood's eyes. "Lies!" he roared, his composure finally cracking. "She's a hysterical runaway, a thief who stole my private papers. Brody, arrest them for slander." But before the sheriff could move, a small, clear voice cut through the noise. "It's true." All eyes turned to Lily. With Nora's hand resting gently on her shoulder, she looked directly at Blackwood, her childish gaze unwavering. "He made my pa sign papers he couldn't read," the little girl said, her voice pure and unafraid. "He promised to help us, but he took our home. He took everything." The child's simple, honest testimony was the spark that lit the powder keg. The crowd surged forward, their collective fear finally boiling over into a righteous, unstoppable rage. "Enough!" Blackwood screamed, pulling his own ornate pistol. "Brody, do your job!" Sheriff Brody, his face slick with sweat, drew his gun and aimed it unsteadily at Caleb. In the same instant, there was a deafening crack. Not from Brody's gun, but from the rifle that had appeared, as if by magic, in Caleb's hands. The pistol was knocked from Brody's grasp, spinning through the air and landing harmlessly in the mud, a clean, perfect hole drilled through its trigger guard. The crowd gasped. It was a stunning, impossible shot, a display of skill so precise it was almost peaceful. Caleb hadn't aimed to kill, he had aimed to disarm, to end the fight before it truly began. The spell of fear was shattered. The townspeople, no longer afraid, closed in on Blackwood. His hired thugs, seeing their leader powerless, melted back into the crowd. Blackwood stood alone, his power, his authority, his entire empire of fear, dissolving into nothing before his very eyes. Part 6. Where the Wild Roses Grow. Dawn broke over a new Redemption Gulch. The air itself felt cleaner, lighter, as if the entire valley had exhaled a breath it had been holding for years. Silas Blackwood was gone. Faced with the collective, unified fury of the town, he had fled in the dead of night, his carriage loaded with what gold he could carry, leaving behind an empire built on paper and fear. Sheriff Brody, stripped of his star and his dignity, was now just a man, tasked by the newly formed town council with mucking out the livery stable until he had worked off a fraction of his debt to the community. A new sense of order, one based on mutual respect rather than coercion, began to take root. The council, with the gruff but fair-minded blacksmith at its head, officially seized the bank. Their first order of business was to open the vault. With Nora's ledger as their guide and Caleb standing as a quiet, watchful guardian, they began the painstaking process of untangling Blackwood's web of deceit. Deeds were returned to their rightful owners, fraudulent loans were publicly forgiven, and a sense of justice, long absent, began to settle over the town like a warm, healing rain. Caleb Thorne's deed was the first one they cleared. He was no longer the town recluse, the haunted soldier whispered about in corners. He was a hero, a man who had faced down the devil and won. He and Nora were offered anything they wanted, a position on the council, the deed to the saloon, but they politely refused. Their victory had not been for power or prestige. It had been for peace, for the simple, hard-won right to build a life on their own terms. They returned to the ranch, not just as victors, but as architects of a new future. The foreclosure notice was taken down from the door, not with anger, but with a quiet ceremony. They used it as kindling for the evening fire, watching as the black, threatening ink curled into ash and vanished up the chimney, taking with it the last shadow of Blackwood's influence. The cabin, once a symbol of Caleb's profound isolation, was now a true home. It began to echo with a sound it hadn't heard in years: laughter. Lily, finally safe and cherished, chased butterflies in the sun-drenched yard, her unburdened joy a balm for their weary souls. The fight was over. The world was quiet again. But this quiet was different from the one that had preceded the storm. It was not an empty, hollow silence, but a peaceful, resonant one, filled with the promise of what was to come. They had faced the worst of men and the worst of nature, and had not only survived, but had emerged stronger, more whole. Now, in the calm after the storm, they faced a new, more daunting question. It was one thing to fight alongside someone, it was another to build a life with them. The external enemy was gone, and now they had to navigate the vast, uncharted territory of their own hearts, learning not just to survive together, but to live. They didn't have a wedding. There were no vows before a preacher, no rings exchanged before a crowd. Their commitment had already been forged in the fires of adversity and sealed with unwavering loyalty, It needed no external validation. A few weeks later, when the last of the snow had melted from the high pastures and the first green shoots of spring were pushing stubbornly through the soil, Caleb took Nora and Lily by the hand. He led them up the gentle slope behind the barn to a small, quiet bluff that overlooked the entire valley. Two simple wooden crosses stood there, weathered by years of sun and snow, the graves of his parents. "This is where my life began," Caleb said softly, his gaze sweeping over the vast expanse of his land, now truly his. "This is where I learned what it means to build something that lasts. It's not just about the land, Nora. It's about the people you share it with, the roots you put down." He turned to her, his eyes full of a love so profound and steady it needed no flowery words. He reached into his pocket, but instead of a ring, he pulled out a small, rough object. It was a single, petrified wild rose he had found by the creek, a thing of delicate, intricate beauty that had somehow, through pressure and time, become as strong and enduring as stone. "I can't promise you an easy life," he said, placing it in her palm. "This land is hard, and the winters are long. But I can promise that you will never face them alone. I promise to build with you, to protect you, and to love you, for all the days of my life." Tears welled in Nora's eyes as she closed her hand around the fossil, its surprising weight a comfort in her palm. "You don't have to promise," she whispered, her voice thick with emotion. "You already have." Lily, sensing the sacredness of the moment, stepped between them and took both their hands, her small gesture binding them together as a family. From that day forward, the ranch was reborn. They officially adopted Lily, her name now legally Thorne. The cabin, once a place of quiet sorrow, became a home filled with the warm smells of baking bread and the bright sound of a child's laughter. Together, the three of them began to plant a small garden near the house. Caleb, the stoic soldier, showed Lily the gentle art of placing a tiny seedling into the earth, his large, scarred hands surprisingly tender. Nora, the resilient nurse, showed her how to water it, how to nurture it into life. As the sun set, casting a warm, golden glow over the valley, Nora stood beside Caleb, watching Lily tend to her small patch of earth. She rested her head on his shoulder, and he wrapped his arm around her, holding his family close. At the edge of the garden, a new addition had been planted, a single, hardy, wild rose bush. It was a symbol of their story, a testament to a love that was not fragile or perfect, but resilient, thorny, and beautiful, thriving in the heart of the wild, untamed West. In the vast and often brutal landscape of the American West, the greatest stories are not written in law books or on property deeds. They are etched into the human heart by quiet acts of courage and profound acts of compassion. The tale of Caleb, Nora, and Lily is a testament to this enduring truth. It reminds us that a home is not a structure of wood and stone, but a sanctuary built from loyalty and love. It shows us that true strength isn't found in unbreakable solitude, but in the vulnerability of standing up for another person. Caleb Thorne, a man broken by war, found healing not by hiding from the world, but by fighting for his place in it. Eleonora Vance, a woman running from tyranny, found freedom not by escaping her past, but by standing her ground and speaking the truth. Their love story, born in the desperation of a blizzard, teaches us that sometimes the most profound connections are forged in the harshest of winters. If their journey from broken strangers to a resilient family has stirred your soul, then you've found a home here. Subscribe now to Wild West Love Stories, where we celebrate the grit, the grace, and the enduring power of love on the American frontier. Because in every lonely cabin and every dusty town, another heart is waiting for its story to be told.